There is a number attached to Mark Carney's first year as Prime Minister that has not received the attention it deserves. He is, according to multiple assessments, traveling more than any Canadian Prime Minister in recorded history, and the itinerary is not random. Let me walk you through what Carney has been building since January, and why the diplomatic architecture he is constructing matters more right now than almost any headline coming out of Washington about Canada. Start with what Carney said publicly in January, because the Davos speech is the document that makes everything else legible. Standing in front of every major economic leader on the planet, Carney described 3 simultaneous construction projects. On trade, he said Canada is championing a bridge between the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the European Union, a combined trading bloc of 1.5 billion people. On critical minerals, he said Canada is forming what he called buyers' clubs, anchored in the G7, designed to give the world an alternative to concentrated supply chains. On artificial intelligence, he said Canada is cooperating with like-minded democracies to ensure no country is ultimately forced to choose between what he called hegemons and hyperscalers. He used a specific word for this approach, not multilateralism, plurilateralism, issue by issue, with partners who share enough common ground to act. That is the framework. Now watch what happened in the months that followed. The CUSMA review, the mandatory renegotiation of the Canada-US-Mexico Agreement, opens formally on July 1st. That date is 40 days away. The U.S. ambassador to Canada described the review process as painstaking, a page-by-page, product-by-product slog that collides directly with American midterm elections later this year, making Senate ratification far from guaranteed. The negotiations, he said, could stretch well into 2027. Canada's response to that timeline was not to wait for Washington to move. The Building Canada Act came into force on January 1, 2026. It removes internal trade barriers between Canadian provinces, barriers that economists estimated were imposing the equivalent of a 7% hidden tariff on domestic commerce. By harmonizing provincial standards, Canada created an integrated internal market of 41 million people before the CUSMA talks had even formally begun. Then Carney told the Canadian press in May that Canada will not use energy or critical minerals as leverage in the upcoming trade talks. But the word he chose to replace leverage was revealing. He said the question is whether further integration with the United States is in Canada's mutual interest, and that if it is not, Canada has other options. Other options? The same week, he said CUSMA stands the test of time and that most of it will be retained. But he added, some things are going to have to change, and we are looking to make sure they change in a way that is in Canada's interest. That sentence from a sitting Prime Minister, 1 week before formal CUSMA review preparations begin, is not diplomatic boilerplate. It is a public statement that the terms of the existing deal are negotiable on Canadian terms. Now here is the architecture underneath those statements. Canada has not signed a separate minerals cooperation agreement with the United States. Washington wanted one. Canada declined. Instead, Carney kept critical minerals inside the CUSMA review, which means they are not a gift Washington can take off the table early. They are the table. Canada controls 21 of the 50 minerals the U.S. Geological Survey designates as critical to American national security. Canada refines 10 of the 12 raw materials NATO classifies as defense critical. China controls roughly 90% of global rare earth processing. The only democratic, rule-of-law jurisdiction with the geological endowment to challenge that dominance at scale is Canada. Carney kept that card in the CUSMA envelope. While Washington has been focused on the bilateral relationship, Carney has been building in every other direction simultaneously. At Davos in January, he laid out the plurilateral vision. At the G7 in Kananaskis in June 2025, which Canada hosted, he spoke 2 different diplomatic languages. In Trump's presence, he deployed calculated flattery and cooperation language. After Trump left early, he spoke of the U.S. administration as a threat to the international order and took a central coordinating role in discussions about trade arrangements designed to work around Washington. Invitation lists for the summit's outreach sessions included leaders Trudeau would not have chosen, substantial geopolitical players with whom Canada had principled disagreements but whose cooperation Carney needed. The G7 Critical Minerals Production Alliance, formed under Canada's G7 presidency, has become the primary global vehicle for channeling allied capital into Canadian mining and refining operations. Germany, Japan, Italy, Finland, Saudi Arabia, every major industrial democracy is signing deals with Canadian operations. In March 2026, Canada secured 30 new international mining partnerships and unlocked $12.1 billion in project capital in a single month. The U.S. ambassador said CUSMA negotiations are painstaking and won't conclude on schedule. Canada built its internal market, locked its minerals inside the review, and signed 30 new international partnerships in the same quarter. The formal review opens in 40 days. Washington is still describing the process as painstaking. Ottawa is describing it as a deadline. Those two governments are not preparing for the same negotiation. There is one more layer to this that the mainstream coverage consistently misses. Carney has been publicly explicit about what plurilateralism actually means in practice. He told the World Economic Forum that this approach creates a dense web of connections across trade, investment, and culture that Canada can draw on for future challenges. He used the word web deliberately. A web does not have a single anchor point. A web distributes stress across every node. When one connection is threatened, the others hold. The contrast with how Washington is approaching the same period is structural. Canada came into the CUSMA review having already removed its internal trade barriers, having locked its critical minerals inside the negotiation, rather than offering them as a concession, having signed a minerals alliance with every major G7 partner, having built alternative export routes for crude oil to Asia, having hit its non-U.S. export diversification targets a full year early, and having declined to offer Washington the one bilateral concession it wanted most, a standalone minerals agreement, before negotiations began. Washington came into the same review still describing the process as painstaking, facing midterm elections that complicate Senate ratification, watching its Commerce Secretary publicly insult the country it needs to negotiate with, and operating through an administration whose tariff authority is simultaneously being challenged at the Supreme Court. The U.S. ambassador said negotiations could stretch into 2027. Carney said much of CUSMA will be retained, and that the parts that change will change in Canada's interest. He is not traveling more than any prime minister in history because Canada is in a weak position. He is traveling because the web he is building requires continuous maintenance, and because every bilateral meeting he completes before July 1st is another node in a structure that Washington cannot unilaterally dismantle. The morning briefings in Ottawa and Washington are covering the same 40-day countdown. They are not reading the same map.